briefing room fell silent when the general slammed his fist on the table. 13 drone operators had failed. 13 precision strikes against a single target that had been moving through the Kandahar Valley for 72 hours, evading satellite tracking, thermal imaging, and every piece of technology the United States Air Force could deploy. The target was a convoy commander whose intelligence network had compromised 3 forward operating bases in 2 months. He knew when the drones were coming. He knew which routes to avoid. He knew everything, and 13 operators had put missiles into empty dirt while he slipped away like smoke. General Marcus Webb stood at the head of the operations center, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical displays that showed nothing but failure. Around him sat the best the Air Force had, young hotshots fresh from specialized training programs, operators who could thread a Hellfire missile through a window from 20,000 feet. But precision meant nothing when the target had already moved. Webb's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Any snipers left? He asked, not looking at anyone in particular. The question hung in the air, rhetorical and bitter. In the back corner of the room, Captain Rhea Navarro sat with her arms folded, watching the display screens with dark eyes that had seen too much. She hadn't spoken during the briefing. She never did. At 34, she was older than most of the operators in the room by almost a decade, and her flight suit bore none of the fresh creases of recent academy graduates. The patches on her shoulders were faded from sun and time, and the call sign stitched above her chest pocket read simply, "Distance." Someone near the front muttered something about luck. Another operator suggested changing approach angles. Webb shook his head, frustration etched into every line of his face. "We don't have time for another miss. This man has killed 17 of our people in 6 weeks. He's moving toward the border, and if he crosses into Pakistan, he's untouchable." The general's gaze swept the room, and for just a moment it landed on Navarro. She didn't move, didn't raise her hand, didn't offer anything. But Webb had seen her file. He'd seen the missions she'd flown when drones were still experimental and pilots still had to look their targets in the eye through a canopy. He knew what distance meant. It wasn't about miles. It was about patience. Webb straightened, his decision made before he'd fully formed the words. "Navarro, you're up." The room turned. Heads swiveled toward the back corner where Navarro sat in shadow. A few exchanged glances, confusion, dismissal, skepticism. One of the younger operators, a lieutenant named Kaufman with 2 confirmed strikes under his belt, let out a low breath that might have been a laugh. "Sir, with respect, we're running 5th-generation targeting systems. If we can't get him." "Then maybe we need 4th-generation instincts," Webb interrupted. His tone left no room for debate. Navarro stood slowly, unfolding from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who never rushed anything. She walked toward the front of the room, her boots barely making sound on the concrete floor. The screens around her displayed the valley in high resolution. Ridgelines, dry riverbeds, scattered compounds built from clay and stone. Somewhere in that maze, the convoy commander was moving. Somewhere in that landscape, he believed he was safe. Navarro studied the displays for 30 seconds without speaking. Her eyes traced elevation lines and road networks, calculating angles and distances that had nothing to do with the computers tracking the target. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying weight. "How long until he reaches the border?" Webb checked the projection. 4 hours, maybe 5 if he stops. Navarro nodded once. "I need a Reaper with extended loiter time and permission to hold fire until I call it." Kaufman scoffed from his seat. "You want to just wait, he's moving, every second Every second he thinks he's safe, he gets predictable," Navarro said, cutting him off without raising her voice. She turned to Webb. "He's been dodging missiles for 3 days. He's exhausted his best options. Now he's running patterns, muscle memory. Give me 6 hours of fuel and a clear channel, I'll find his rhythm." Webb studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against desperation. Then he nodded. "You've got it. But Navarro, this is the last shot we have." She met his gaze without flinching. "It's the only one I'll need." The operations center transitioned into controlled chaos as Navarro moved to her station. a smaller console away from the main displays where she could work without the chatter of other operators. The Reaper she'd been assigned was already airborne, circling at 28,000 feet over the valley with a full payload and enough fuel for 8 hours of flight. The aircraft was a ghost in the sky, gray and angular, wings stretched wide, cameras and sensors pointing downward like the eyes of a patient predator. Navarro pulled on her headset and brought up the feed, her hands moving across the controls with the ease of someone who'd logged more flight hours than most pilots half her age. The drone's camera showed the valley in shades of gray and green, heat signatures blooming like flowers across the thermal overlay. Vehicles moved along dirt roads, civilians going about their lives unaware of the silent machine above them. Navarro ignored the obvious targets, the clusters of movement that drew attention. She was looking for something else, a pattern, a hesitation, a choice that revealed calculation. The convoy commander wasn't running blind. He was thinking. And people who thought too much eventually thought in circles. She keyed her mic. Distance is on station. Beginning observation. Webb's voice crackled back. Copy. Clock is running. Navarro didn't respond. She was already gone, lost in the rhythm of the hunt. Around her, other operators watched their own screens, some still working their shifts, others simply waiting to see if the quiet woman in the corner could do what 13 others couldn't. Kaufman leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, skepticism written across his face. She's gonna wait him across the border, he muttered to the operator beside him. Old school means old and slow. But Navarro wasn't slow. She was deliberate. Her eyes tracked the terrain below, memorizing every compound, every intersection, every place where the road narrowed or widened. She watched vehicles come and go, noting which ones moved with purpose and which ones wandered. Time became fluid in the way it always did during long flights, minutes stretching into hours, hours compressing into moments. The sun moved across the sky in the drone's camera, shadows shifting across the valley floor. And somewhere below, the convoy commander was moving, thinking he'd outlasted another day of American technology. He'd be tired now, relieved, maybe even confident. That confidence would kill him. 3 hours into the flight, Navarro spotted the first thread. A white pickup truck, nothing unusual in a region where every third vehicle looked identical, but this one moved differently. It stopped at an intersection, idled for 40 seconds, then turned north instead of continuing west toward the border. The stop was too long for a casual decision, too short for a breakdown. It was a check-in. Navarro marked the location and kept watching. 30 minutes later, another vehicle, a sedan this time, made the same turn at the same intersection after a similar pause. Twice was a pattern, 3 times was a route. She keyed her mic. I've got a waypoint, uploading now. Webb's voice came back immediately. Talk to me, distance. Navarro highlighted the intersection on the shared display. He's using spotters, vehicles checking the route before the main convoy moves through. They're confirming clear passage, then he follows 10 to 15 minutes behind. There was a pause on the line. Then Webb's voice, quieter. Can you confirm the main target? Navarro shook her head even though he couldn't see it. Not yet, but I will. He's coming. Around the operations center, attention shifted toward her console. Even Kaufman sat forward, watching the feed over her shoulder. Another hour passed. The sun dipped lower, painting the valley in amber and shadow. Navarro's eyes never left the screen. Her hands made micro-adjustments to the drone's position, keeping it in a wide orbit that wouldn't draw attention from anyone watching the sky. And then, just as the light began to fade, she saw it. A black SUV, newer than most vehicles in the area, moving north along the same road the spotters had checked. It didn't stop at the intersection. It didn't need to. The path was clear. But what caught Navarro's attention wasn't the vehicle itself. It was the way it moved. Steady, unhurried, confident. The driver wasn't fleeing, he was commuting. She zoomed the camera in, enhancing the image until she could see the SUV's details. No markings, tinted windows, dust-covered but not beaten down by rough roads. This was a vehicle that spent most of its time hidden, only coming out when necessary. Navarro's pulse stayed steady, her breathing even. She'd been here before in this exact moment where instinct and evidence aligned. She keyed her mic. "I've got eyes on probable target. Black SUV, northbound on Route 7. Requesting clearance to track." Webb's response was immediate. "Granted, stay on him." The Reaper banked gently, adjusting its orbit to keep the SUV centered in the camera's frame. Navarro watched the vehicle move through the valley, noting every turn, every change in speed. The driver was good, not erratic, not obvious, but good in a way that betrayed training, military training. This wasn't a farmer or a trader. This was someone who knew how to move through hostile territory without attracting attention. The SUV passed through 2 more intersections, each time maintaining the same steady pace. Navarro's eyes flicked to the map overlay on her screen. The border was 90 kilometers ahead. At current speed, the target would cross in just over an hour. Behind her, she heard Webb's voice addressing the room. "All stations, we have probable target tracking. I want confirmation before we commit." Another operator brought up satellite imagery, cross-referencing the SUV's path with known safe houses and supply routes. The data started coming together. This vehicle had been seen before, always at night, always moving north. Intelligence had flagged it twice but never had assets in position to track it. Now they did. Navarro kept her breathing steady, her hands loose on the controls. The Reaper circled in silence, invisible and patient. This was what she'd trained for, not the shot itself, but the waiting before it. The ability to watch without acting, to hold fire until the moment crystallized into certainty. The SUV turned east suddenly, leaving the main road for a narrower track that wound between rocky hills. Navarro adjusted course immediately, keeping altitude to avoid detection. The turn was significant. This wasn't the direct route to the border anymore. This was evasive. The driver was checking for pursuit, using terrain to mask movement. It was exactly the kind of decision a careful commander would make when he thought he was almost home. Navarro's voice was calm when she keyed her mic. "Target is deviating from primary route. Possible evasion maneuver. Maintaining track," Webb acknowledged. "Stay with him." The narrow track led to a small compound built against a hillside, barely visible in the fading light. The SUV slowed as it approached, and Navarro caught the brief flash of headlights, a signal. The compound's gate opened and the vehicle pulled inside. Navarro didn't fire. Not yet. She needed confirmation, and she needed the target outside where collateral damage could be minimized. The Reaper held position, camera locked on the compound. Minutes ticked by. Then movement, figures emerging from the main building. 3 men, one of them taller than the others, wearing light-colored clothing that stood out against the darker walls. The tall man moved with authority, gesturing as he spoke to the others. Navarro zoomed in, enhancing the image. She could see his face now, grainy but clear enough. She pulled up the target profile on her secondary screen and compared. Height matched, build matched, facial structure matched. The man in the compound was their convoy commander. She keyed her mic, her voice steady. "Positive ID on target. Compound grid 774321. 3 individuals visible, 1 confirmed hostile, requesting weapons clearance." There was a pause, then Webb's voice carrying the weight of command. "Clearance granted. You are authorized to engage." Navarro's hands moved without hesitation. She armed the Hellfire missile, feeling the familiar thunk through the controls as the weapon went live. The targeting reticle appeared on her screen, a small cross that she positioned over the compound's courtyard where the 3 men stood. The math was simple from here: range, wind speed, target movement, probability of success. She'd done it 1,000 times in training and dozens in combat. But this shot was different. This shot had 13 failures behind it and an entire operations center watching. The tall man moved toward the SUV, still talking to his companions. Navarro tracked him smoothly, keeping the reticle centered on his chest. Her finger rested on the trigger, light and ready. But she didn't fire, not yet. The compound's walls were close, and the other 2 men were near enough that the blast might kill them too. She needed clean separation, needed the target to move into open ground where the missile's fragmentation would be contained. Patience. Always patience. The seconds stretched. The target opened the SUV's door, leaned inside, retrieved something, a bag, maybe papers. Then he stepped away from the vehicle, moving toward the center of the courtyard. Alone, clear, perfect. Navarro's voice was quiet, almost conversational. Distance. Rifle. She squeezed the trigger. The Hellfire dropped from the Reaper's wing with a mechanical thunk, ignition flaring as the rocket motor kicked in. The missile streaked downward through 28,000 feet of empty air, adjusting course with tiny control surfaces as its seeker head locked onto the laser designation Navarro was painting on the target. The flight time was 17 seconds. Navarro counted them internally, watching the target stand in the courtyard, oblivious to the death falling toward him from the sky. 17 seconds. Then the screen flared white. The Hellfire detonated in the center of the courtyard with the force of a contained thunderstorm, blast and fragmentation tearing through the space where the tall man had been standing. The shockwave blew out windows and kicked up a column of dust that rose into the twilight. Navarro kept the camera steady, waiting for the dust to clear. When it did, the courtyard was a crater. The tall man was gone, not wounded, not running, simply gone. The other two figures were on the ground, thrown by the blast but moving. Alive. Collateral had been minimal. The target had been eliminated with surgical precision. Navarro leaned back in her chair, pulling off her headset. Around her, the operations center erupted in controlled celebration. Operators clapping, Webb's voice on the command channel confirming the kill, intelligence analysts already cross-referencing the strike for after-action reports. But Navarro didn't join the noise. She simply looked at the screen, watching the dust settle over the compound, and felt nothing but the familiar weight of completion. Another target, another mission. Another day where precision mattered more than speed. She stood and began shutting down her console, methodical and unhurried. Kaufman was at her station before she'd finished, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "How the hell did you know he'd stop there?" he asked. Navarro glanced at him, her expression neutral. "I didn't. I knew he'd stop somewhere, I just waited until he did." Kaufman shook his head. 13 operators couldn't get him in 3 days and you did it in 6 hours. That's not just patience. That's, he trailed off, searching for the word. Navarro finished packing her gear and slung her flight bag over her shoulder. "Experience," she said simply. Then she walked out of the operations center, leaving the noise and light behind. Webb caught up with her in the hallway outside, his face still flushed with the adrenaline of a successful mission. "Hell of a shot, Captain," he said. Navarro nodded once, acknowledging the compliment without absorbing it. Webb studied her for a moment, then asked the question that had been on his mind since he'd reviewed her file. "Why distance? Your call sign. Most pilots pick something flashy. Yours sounds like a measurement." Navarro paused, considering whether to answer. Then she said, "Because it's not about how fast you get there. It's about how far you can see." Webb smiled, understanding blooming across his weathered face. "And you see pretty damn far." Navarro didn't respond. She just walked away down the corridor, her boots echoing on the concrete, leaving the general standing alone with the knowledge that he'd just witnessed something rare. A pilot who understood that war wasn't about technology or speed or firepower. It was about patience, and nobody had more patience than distance. That night, Navarro sat alone in her quarters on the airbase, a small room with a narrow bed and a desk cluttered with maintenance manuals and flight logs. She didn't sleep immediately. She never did after a mission. Instead, she sat by the window and looked out at the tarmac where the Reapers sat in their hardened shelters, gray shapes under floodlights. The sky above was clear and full of stars, the same sky she'd flown under for 16 years. The same sky that had taken friends and given her purpose. Her call sign hadn't always been distance. When she'd first joined the Air Force at 18, fresh out of a small town in New Mexico where the horizon stretched forever, she'd been Rhea. Just Rhea, no decoration, no mythology. She'd wanted to fly fighters, F-16 screaming through combat air patrols, but her eyesight had been a fraction off standard, enough to disqualify her from the fast jets. So she'd gone to drones instead, back when drones were still called UAVs, and pilots still fought for legitimacy in a world that valued hands on sticks and G-forces over remote operations. Her first squadron commander had been a gruff colonel named Patterson who'd flown A-10s in Desert Storm and didn't think much of pilots who couldn't feel their aircraft through their spine. He'd made that clear during her first briefing, telling her and the other drone operators that they were playing video games while real pilots put their lives on the line. Navarro had absorbed the comment without reaction, then proceeded to log more combat hours in her first year than Patterson had flown in his last 5. Eventually, he'd stopped talking about video games. Eventually, he'd started calling her distance, because no matter how far away the target was, she found it. The name stuck. Through 3 deployments and a dozen temporary duty assignments, through upgrades from Predators to Reapers to systems that didn't have names yet, distance became her identity. Other operators came and went, chasing promotions or burning out under the stress of killing people from 7,000 miles away. But Navarro stayed. She stayed because someone had to, because precision mattered. Because the alternative was missiles landing in the wrong compounds, on the wrong people, turning allies into enemies and enemies into martyrs. She stayed because she was good at waiting. And in modern warfare, waiting was a dying art. She thought about the 13 operators who'd missed the convoy commander. Young, talented, eager. They'd all done everything right according to their training, acquired the target, calculated the shot, fired at the optimal moment. But they'd fired when the target was moving, when the variables were changing, when speed seemed more important than certainty. They'd fired because the pressure to act had overwhelmed the discipline to wait. Navarro had waited. She'd watched the target move through his patterns until the pattern broke, until he felt safe enough to stop. Then she'd taken the shot, not when it was fast, when it was right. The next morning, Navarro reported for her regular duty shift and found the operations center atmosphere changed. The usual competitive banter between operators had been replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. When she entered, several operators nodded to her, acknowledgement that hadn't been there before. Kaufman approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering her one. "Figured you drink it black," he said. Navarro accepted the cup and took a sip. It was terrible, burned and bitter, but she didn't comment. Kaufman leaned against the console beside hers. "I watched the replay last night, 3 times. You held that shot for almost 40 seconds after you had clearance. Why?" Navarro set the coffee down and powered up her console. "Because 40 seconds was how long it took for the shot to be clean." Kaufman nodded slowly. "Most of us would have taken it the moment he was in the open. Target confirmed, weapon authorized, engagement window open." Navarro met his eyes. "And most of you missed." The words weren't harsh, just factual. Kaufman absorbed them without offense. "Yeah, we did." He straightened, preparing to return to his own station, then paused. "For what it's worth, some of us are starting to get it. That thing you said about rhythm, about waiting for predictability. I ran it past my last 3 misses. Every single one I fired when the target was adapting. If I'd waited another 60 seconds, they would have settled." Navarro allowed herself a small nod. "Good, don't forget it." Kaufman walked away and Navarro turned her attention to the day's briefing materials, but she'd heard the shift in his voice, the transition from skepticism to understanding. That shift mattered more than any successful strike, because when the shooting stopped and the missions ended, what remained was knowledge. Knowledge passed from one operator to another, one generation to the next. That was the real distance she'd been measuring all along, not miles, but the gap between knowing and understanding. Webb appeared at her station mid-morning, a tablet in his hand and an expression that suggested both good news and complication. "Got something for you," he said, pulling up a classified briefing on the tablet. "High-value target, similar profile to yesterday. Multiple failed engagements, time-sensitive, requires precision." He handed her the tablet. Navarro scanned the details, another convoy commander, different region, same pattern of evasion and counter-surveillance. She looked up at Webb. "When?" He checked his watch. "Asset is wheels up in 2 hours, your primary operator. No one else even gets a shot unless you pass. Navarro handed back the tablet. I'll need full operational autonomy. No command overrides, no timeline pressure. I take the shot when it's ready, not when someone thinks it should be ready. Webb considered this, weighing protocol against results. Then he nodded. You've got it. But Navarro, command is watching. You thread this needle twice in 2 days and you're going to get attention. The kind of attention that comes with promotions and reassignments. Navarro's expression didn't change. I'm not interested in attention, General. I'm interested in getting it right. Webb smiled, a tired expression that suggested he'd expected that answer. That's why you're the one flying the mission. 2 hours later, Navarro was back in her console, headset on, hands on controls, watching another Reaper climb through 30,000 feet over hostile territory. This time, the operations center was quieter. Other operators worked their own missions, but several kept one eye on Distance's feed, watching to see if yesterday had been skill or luck. Navarro ignored them. The target was all that mattered. A man who'd killed 9 coalition soldiers in ambushes, who moved through the mountains like water, who'd survived 4 attempts on his life by hiding in caves and villages where drones couldn't follow. But even ghosts had to come out eventually. Even the most careful commanders made mistakes. 6 hours into the flight, Navarro found the thread. Not a vehicle this time, but a communication pattern. The target was using a radio frequency that intelligence had flagged but couldn't decrypt, sending short bursts every 90 minutes. Navarro triangulated the bursts with signals intelligence and realized the transmissions were coming from different locations each time. The target was moving, but the intervals were consistent. 90 minutes. Like clockwork. Rhythm. She keyed her mic. Distance has a pattern, uploading signal analysis. Webb's voice came back. What are you thinking? Navarro studied the map. He transmits from high ground, needs line of sight for his radios. I'm looking for the next ridgeline on his route. Intelligence overlaid terrain analysis on the map, highlighting 3 possible locations. Navarro eliminated 2 immediately, 2 exposed, too far from water sources, too obvious. The third was a narrow plateau between 2 valleys, perfect for radio transmission and defensible enough for a brief stop. She directed the Reaper toward the plateau and waited. 30 minutes passed. 60. At 87 minutes since the last transmission, movement appeared on the thermal camera, 2 figures climbing the ridge, one carrying equipment. Navarro zoomed in. One figure set up what looked like a portable antenna while the other stood watch. Military discipline, tactical awareness. This was the target's security team, which meant the target himself was close. She widened her search pattern and found him. A single figure in a shallow cave entrance 50 meters below the plateau, partially concealed by rocks but visible on infrared. He was waiting for his men to confirm the radio link before exposing himself. Smart, careful, but ultimately predictable. Navarro armed a Hellfire and positioned the Reaper for optimal strike angle. She waited for the security team to finish their setup and descend from the plateau. Waited for the target to emerge from the cave, believing his transmission would be secure. Waited for the moment when caution gave way to routine. When it came, she didn't hesitate. Distance. Rifle. The missile streaked down through clear mountain air and detonated against the cave entrance just as the target stepped into sunlight. The blast collapsed the entrance and triggered a secondary rockslide that buried the site under tons of stone. When the dust cleared, there was no movement. No survivors, just silence and settling debris. Navarro began her post-strike documentation, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Behind her, the operations center absorbed what they'd just witnessed, 2 high-value targets eliminated in 2 days with 2 shots. No misses, no second chances required, just patience and precision. Kaufman's voice broke the silence. Distance is 2 for 2. Someone else added, that's not luck, that's a whole different level. Webb's voice came over the command channel, formal and clear. Confirmed kill, excellent work, Distance. Secure your station and report for debrief. Navarro acknowledged and began shutdown procedures. But before she could finish, another operator, A young woman named Torres, who'd been flying drones for less than a year, approached her console. "Captain Navarro." "Can I ask you something?" Navarro glanced up. "Make it quick." Torres hesitated, then asked, "How do you know when to wait and when to shoot? Everyone says patience, but nobody explains how to measure it." Navarro considered the question. It was the right question, the kind that deserved more than a dismissive answer. She finished securing her console and turned to face Torres fully. "You watch for the moment the target stops thinking about you. That's when they're vulnerable. Not when they're running, not when they're hiding, when they stop and breathe and think they're safe. That's when you take the shot." Torres absorbed this, nodding slowly. "But how do you know they've stopped thinking about you?" Navarro allowed herself a slight smile. "Because they do something routine. Something that doesn't account for the possibility that you're still watching. Routine is the enemy of survival." Torres thanked her and returned to her station, and Navarro gathered her gear. As she walked out of the operations center, she passed groups of operators who watched her with a new kind of attention, not celebrity but professional respect. The kind earned through results, not rhetoric. She didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. The mission was what mattered, the clean shots, the minimal collateral, the precision that saved lives by taking others. That was the job, everything else was noise. The debrief with Webb lasted 30 minutes and covered tactical decisions, timing, communication protocols, and target confirmation. Webb asked pointed questions, and Navarro answered with the same methodical clarity she brought to her flights. When it was over, Webb leaned back in his chair and studied her. "You know what's happening here, right? 2 days, 2 perfect missions. Command is going to want to replicate this. They're going to want to know how you do what you do so they can teach it to others." Navarro met his gaze. "You can't teach patience to people who have never had to learn it. You can explain it, but understanding comes from necessity." Webb nodded. "Fair point, but they'll try anyway." He pulled up a document on his screen. "I'm putting you in for a commendation. You've earned it." Navarro's expression didn't change. "I'd rather you didn't, sir." Webb raised an eyebrow. "Why the hell not?" Navarro chose her words carefully. "Because commendations draw attention, and attention creates pressure to perform in ways that compromise precision. I do my job well because nobody's watching close enough to demand I do it faster." Webb stared at her for a long moment, then closed the document. "All right, no commendation, but you're on the high-value target list now. That doesn't go away." Navarro stood. "Understood." She left Webb's office and walked through the base in the late afternoon heat, past rows of aircraft and maintenance crews and young airmen who had no idea what happened in the operations centers buried beneath concrete and classified clearances. She thought about Torres' question, "How do you know when to wait?" and realized it wasn't a question you could answer with words. It was a question you answered with hours in the air, missions that succeeded and missions that failed, moments where hesitation saved lives and moments where speed cost them. Experience was the only teacher, and experience required time. Time to fail, time to learn, time to understand that war wasn't about quick draws and split-second decisions. It was about slow burns and patient calculations. It was about distance. That evening, Navarro found herself in the base's small recreation room, a space with a few tables, a television showing news from half a world away, and a group of younger operators playing cards. She didn't usually come here, preferred the solitude of her quarters, but something pulled her in. Maybe the need to be around people who understood the work without needing to discuss it. She grabbed a bottle of water from the vending machine and sat at an empty table, content to watch the card game without participating. Kaufman noticed her and waved her over. "You play poker, distance."